Hey, we're good.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott.
Yep.
Madison, are you going to be sharing the PowerPoint or would you like me to?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. We are so excited to have everyone here today. We are celebrating Juneteenth, our nation's second Independence Day. This is our second to last, our penultimate virtual program of the day called The Road to Freedom, the Story of Slavery in America. We've got about 4 minutes until we get started, but do me a favor, everyone, and test out that chat feature for me. Let me know where you're tuning in from, who you are tuning in with, how you are celebrating Juneteenth today, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes. Very nice. Welcome, Virginia. It looks like we've got New Jersey, California is represented. Welcome, everyone. We've got 3 minutes until go time. This is one of my favorite programs that we offer at the National Constitution Center. The education team created this program. It's called The Road to Freedom, the Story of Slavery in America. And we look really back to the nation's founding and see how slavery was very much present as we created the Constitution. So we're going to look at some freedom seekers. We're going to look at some events that kind of bring us up to the Civil War and kind of briefly recap Reconstruction and how we get from a society with enslaved individuals to a free society. So we are super excited to have everyone here joining us. Hello, Mr. Rowenka. It's so nice to see you. Hello to the kids. So excited that you're all here. We are pumped that you are here celebrating Juneteenth with us. This is going to be a fun one. We've got 2 minutes until go time, friends. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. We have had program after program today, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen my face today. I see a lot of returning people. Hello, it's good to see you all again. Yes, very excited. Iowa in the house, Michigan's here, Virginia, California, Oregon. So many fun places. I love it. Lucky for me, though, I'm not alone in this endeavor. You do not have to listen to me this whole time. I'm joined by my wonderful colleague at the National Constitution Center, Kevin Lynch, who's going to join us in just a minute. Hey, Kevin, and is going to share with us a little bit about the history of slavery in America. So, Kevin, we've got about 1 minute until go time, and then we're going to go ahead and get started.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. We're looking forward to it.
Awesome. Oh, I love it. Rosemary, you're celebrating Juneteenth, helping out at a voter registration station. What a beautiful way to celebrate the holiday. I love that. That is absolutely perfect. This is absolutely a celebration today. We are so excited that you're all here. All right, we've got 1 more minute until we begin our program. Super excited to have all of you folks here today celebrating Juneteenth, the nation's second Independence Day, a very important date in history, and we are excited to share more with you. Happy to see some of my friends who've been with me all day today. I love it. Oh, Kevin, we're getting some love. We're quite the dynamic host today. We're the dynamic duo. I am honored. This is going to be a fun one. All right, Kevin, it is about that time. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. All right, everyone. Welcome to the National Constitution Center. My name is Madison. I'm a member of the center's education team, and happy Juneteenth to all of you. We are celebrating with programs all day long, and you can find resources at constitutioncenter.org to dive more into this holiday. But we are going to look at a special program that we have now called The Road to Freedom Show. It was written by our very own Kevin Lynch, who is here with us today. It is the story of slavery in America. So Kevin is going to walk us through some major events events that lead us right up to the Civil War, and is going to dive into some of the histories and the lesser known figures and events that bring the nation toward the Civil War, with the ultimate, obviously, end here being the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment, and the connections that those have to Juneteenth. So, Kevin, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Madison. And thank you, everyone who is joining us and making us part of your Juneteenth commemoration. My name is Kevin. I work with the National Constitution Center. And if you've been joining us for our programs, we have spent the day listening to amazing figures and storytellers talking about Juneteenth. And a day that, while maybe has only recently gained status as a federal holiday, is one that has been of incredible significance to many people for over 150 years now. So we've heard all this storytelling, and we're going to continue to look at some stories about the fight to end slavery in America. So I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen, and we will take a look at some of these stories. And we begin, of course, as we always do, with 1787 and the Constitution. Of course, so much of this story takes place in the middle of the 19th century, but it does really begin here with the founding. And of course, we know that for all the success that the founders had in creating this new form of government, it was one that does come with the burden of slavery, what some scholars have referred to as America's original sin. So how do we get here, of course? Well, we know that during the Constitutional Convention, compromises were made over the question of slavery. There were some delegates who called for an end to the practice, or at least perhaps an end to the slave trade. But there were many others who felt that slavery needed to be included in the Constitution, and they, in fact, would leave the convention without it. So we do have what becomes the infamous 3/5 compromise, agreeing to count enslaved persons as 3/5 of an individual. So the Constitution and the way that we look at the country as it would have been in 1787 looks largely like this. And we know, of course, that we have the 13 original states, the former British colonies. And you might be surprised to know that, in fact, all of them during colonial periods did, in fact, allow the practice of slavery. This will, of course, begin to change, but slavery is unquestionably a fact of life for people living in colonial America. And we look at how is it that we can grapple with this at the same time having this incredible promise of freedom and equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, one of the founders who perhaps comes under the greatest criticism or scrutiny today for his seemingly conflicting opinions on slavery is, of course, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and that famous phrase, "All men are created equal." What is perhaps less known is that there was, in fact, a passage in the original draft of the Declaration of Independence specifically calling out the evils of the slave trade in the United States and laying the blame for the practice at the foot of the King of England. So we take a look now at this quote here. He has waged he, meaning King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere. This piratical warfare is the warfare of the King of Great Britain. So here we have Jefferson acknowledging that slavery is, in fact, cruel warfare against human nature. But those of you, of course, who use the Declaration of Independence in your studies and perhaps don't recognize this passage, of course, it does not make the final cut of the Declaration. This ultimately is removed from the final version of the Declaration. And Jefferson, like many of the founders, is never quite able to reconcile the question of slavery during his lifetime. At one point, referring it to a wolf by the ears. You didn't like it, but you didn't dare let it go. Now, as we move forward here into the 19th century, we begin to see this divide in the country between free states and those hanging on to the institution of slavery. Some states in the North begin to do away with slavery immediately. In fact, one of the perhaps earliest calls for using the Declaration of Independence comes from a man named Prince Hall in Massachusetts in 1777, calling on the Massachusetts legislature to do away with the practice of slavery, arguing that it was inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And ultimately, the legislature in Massachusetts and many of the New England states would do just that. Coming down south, several of the other states, including Pennsylvania, would pass acts of gradual emancipation. So in Pennsylvania's case, the act was passed in 1780 and would ultimately grant freedom to anyone who was born into that state after their 28th birthday. And states like New Jersey and New York would adopt similar practices. But we see here in the southern states, of course, holding on to the institution of slavery. And with the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution, the number of enslaved persons would add increasingly to their political power. But at the same time as this divide is happening between North and South, we have the country expanding west, occupying this vast territory from sea to shining sea. And we see the expansion on this map here. And with each new state, something that we think might be cause for national celebration, it would further inflame the question of slavery by posing, would each new territory be free or would slavery be allowed to continue? And this really reaches a critical moment in 1820 with the question of whether or not Missouri would be added to the Union as a free state or a slave state. Ultimately, it was decided that Missouri would be added as a slave state. To keep the balance in Congress and in the country, Maine, which up to this point had been part of Massachusetts, would be added as a free state. And Congress adopted a line, agreeing to draw a line across the southern border of Missouri, expanding west. And the notion was any territory added north of that line would be free. Any territory south of that line was open to slavery. The so-called Missouri Compromise that was designed to hold the nation together. But with the increasing divide between North and Southern states, that compromise becomes increasingly fragile. In the Northern states, many moving perhaps toward more industry, less reliance on agriculture, but also we begin to see a movement and a growing voice from people who feel that slavery is abhorrently evil and must be done away with immediately, the abolition movement. And their cry would grow louder into the 1830s and 40s. Which brings us now to a building right across the street from the National Constitution Center. If you've been to our museum and you're familiar with our location in historic Philadelphia, right across the street, there is a historical marker for this building, Pennsylvania Hall, which was built, funded by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, constructed in 1838, and was said to be the most splendid building in all of Philadelphia. And it was designed to be a place where people could come and speak out against the evils of slavery. The bottom floor would have been a series of offices and printing presses for abolitionist newspapers to disseminate anti-slavery information across the country. And the top floor, these two rows of windows here, would have been a lecture hall that could seat up to about 3,000 people. And ultimately, and tragically, this building was also fitted with some of the most modern technology at the time, gas lighting. Now, 3 days after this building opened, a woman named Angelina Grimke was to be the keynote speaker. And this, of course, was a rarity. This was in an era where women of any race were not expected to speak publicly about political or social issues. And many of the earliest would become suffragists, fighters for women's right to vote, got their start publicly by supporting the anti-slavery cause, including Angelina and her sister Sarah Grimke. And in 1838, Angelina delivers an address against the evils of slavery, and we have a portion from that passage up here on the screen. And as she's doing so, a pro-slavery crowd gathers outside of the building. Grimke says, "Those voices without tell us that the spirit of slavery is here and has been roused to wrath by our abolition speeches and conventions. This opposition shows that the spirit of slavery has done its work in the hearts of our citizens. Do you ask then, what has the North to do? I answer, cast out first the spirit of slavery from your own heart and lend your aid to convert the South. Each one present has work to do." Grimke finishes her speech and returns home. But the next day, this pro-slavery crowd returns to Pennsylvania Hall and burns it to the ground. The building lasted 3 days, illustrating the struggle for free speech, what type of speech was allowed to be discussed over slavery during this time, and illustrating just how passionate the fight against slavery had become. Now, while people like Angelina and Sarah Grimke and other prominent abolitionist leaders would deliver their speeches publicly and take their fight against slavery publicly, there were, of course, many others who fought against it in more subtle ways, particularly through that system that we're all familiar with today, the Underground Railroad. Now, it's impossible to say for certain exactly how many freedom seekers used this method, a series of stations, houses, conductors, to make their way into freedom. There weren't a lot of records kept for obvious reasons. But there was a man living in Philadelphia who does keep records and becomes known to us as the father of the Underground Railroad. I believe he was referenced in a few of our earlier programs, and his name was William Still, living in Philadelphia. And he does keep accounts of the names of freedom seekers, where they had escaped from, where they were traveling next, if they were going to change their name, adopt a new alias, what that new name might be. And several of these are known to us today. We might have heard perhaps earlier the story of Henry Box Brown, who literally ships himself to freedom. From Still's work, we also know the story of the escape of William and Ellen Craft, a married couple who pretended to be a servant, an enslaved person traveling with their white owner. We also, though, perhaps get the story, perhaps one of the most remarkable, is that where William Still takes the account of a man who recently had come to Philadelphia, and still going through his normal routine of asking names if he knew who parents were and where he had lived. And William Still discovers, to his own amazement, that the person he was talking to was, in fact, his own brother, Peter. So it's this wonderful resource of meaningful stories of Still keeping these records. And after the threat of the Civil War, Still is in fact able to publish his records. You can still buy later editions of his book today. At the Constitution Center, we are proud to display a first edition printing from 1872, and it remains by far the best first person account of the stories of the Underground Railroad. Now, as we fast forward into the 1850s here, we really do begin to get to a critical period, one that would severely test and even break the Missouri Compromise that we referenced earlier. We see on this new map the increasing divide between free states and slave states. And in 1854, we have the petition of Kansas and Nebraska, this vast territory, which under the old agreement of the Missouri Compromise would have been free territory. But a congressman named Stephen Douglas, actually a senator, Stephen Douglas, the same Douglas of the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, brings a plan known as popular sovereignty to the desk of the president. And this plan would overthrow the Missouri Compromise and allow this vast territory to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery to exist in that territory. Now, the immediate effect of this Kansas-Nebraska Act is a rush of thousands of pro and anti-slavery settlers into the Kansas territory, which erupts into bleeding Kansas and brings the nation even closer to war. But as we sort of have this fight going on the ground, we also have a much more significant fight, perhaps, in court. And we have perhaps one of the most infamous decisions in the history of the court. And that involves the case, and note the Minnesota territory that we see up there. This involves the case of a man named Dred Scott. We're familiar with this case, the Dred Scott case. Dred had been living in free territory, what is now Minnesota, and petitioned the court for their freedom. Ultimately, he loses his opinion, or he loses his case, and in the opinion of Chief Justice Roger Taney, the Scots had no right that a white man was bound to respect. This is the story that we've heard about the Dred Scott case. But it's a great example of if we, through storytelling and learning more about the figures involved, it can really sort of change how we look at this. It's important to note that Dred was not the only person to file a freedom suit. In fact, his wife, Harriet, may have even been more of a force in arguing for their freedom. And we actually know more recently about Harriet Scott. In fact, their marriage was much more formal than one traditionally afforded to enslaved couples. And right around the time that they filed their first freedom suit in 1846, their children were born, one of their last of their children. So it's much more of a family story and a fight for freedom. It takes 11 years before their case makes it up to the court. And the courts could have simply ruled on their one specific case, whether or not they would be free. But seemingly in an attempt to settle the question of slavery once and for all, the court makes a much broader ruling, arguing that Congress had no right to interfere in any respect with slavery in any part of the country. So this question of whether or not Congress could interfere with slavery pushes the nation even that much farther toward war. But if we look at it from the perspective of Harriet and Dred Scott fighting for their families' rights, then this opinion from Chief Justice Taney, it becomes that much harder to accept. But with the Dred Scott case, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, coupled with the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, John Brown's Raid, the nation is increasingly moving that much faster toward war. Which brings us now to the most polarized of our maps here, with the presidential election of 1860. So much so that there were 4 different candidates for president, and the eventual winner, Abraham Lincoln, was not even featured on the ballot in many of the southern states. Lincoln would, of course, win this election in 1860, becoming the first Republican to win the presidency. And he comes back into politics largely out of outrage at this blatant expansion of slavery that had occurred in recent years. But of course, in response to Lincoln's election, South Carolina becomes the first state to secede. And by the time Lincoln assumes the presidency, as many as 11 southern states had seceded from the Union. I'm sorry, it's actually the darker red ones here, and then after the violence of Fort Sumter, these 4 others in the light red would secede, becoming, of course, the Confederate States of America. Which brings us now to sort of this last quote that we have from President Lincoln: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And we think back to the Union and its expansion, and a great symbolism is almost like a Jenga tower. As we have the expansion of the country, but within the question of slavery, like a Jenga tower, the country is growing larger, but in doing so, not necessarily growing stronger. Lincoln's quote here: "I do not believe, or I believe that the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to dissolve. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect that it will cease to be divided." So what we've seen is that original Union that was created in 1787, that ultimately existed half slave and half free, it could not endure. It could not stand the way that it was. What is needed then is a reconstruction of a newer house, a better house, one more dedicated to the idea that not just all men, but all people are created equal, and to better live up to what Lincoln would call for a new birth of freedom. And this is something that is not accomplished by one person or a series of individuals, but many. We've heard just a few of these stories today, but so many people fighting for this cause of freedom and equality. And this is the fight that is central to the message of Juneteenth, why we're all here today. So with that, everyone, I want to thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to our host, Madison. But thank you all again for joining us today and making us part of your Juneteenth.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That is always such a wonderful program, and I always learn oh so much. But friends, I want to thank you so much for tuning in to The Road to Freedom, the story of slavery in America. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share all of this knowledge with your friends, your family, your students, anyone who you want to share it with. We have one final virtual program today for Juneteenth. Our last one will be held at 3:45 Eastern, called The Four Harriets of History, where we're going to look at four women, all named Harriet, who used their voices and their unique experiences to fight against slavery and fight for the freedom for all. So it's going to be a wonderful program. We hope to see you there. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in. It's always a pleasure to see you all here. And we love that you're celebrating Juneteenth with us. If you have any questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. I know that Kevin's going to stick around and maybe answer a question or two if we have some time. But if you have no other questions, feel free to log in at 3:45 Eastern for that final program, or we will see you at another time at the National Constitution Center. All right. Thank you for coming, everyone, and very happy Juneteenth to all. All right, Kevin, I'm not seeing any other questions, but let me see. It looks like there are
I did see one in the Q&A referencing the map from 1860, and there were some yellow states, color-coded yellow, that I failed to reference during the program. And those, of course, were what would become the border states, talking about Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And these were states that allowed the practice of slavery, but ultimately never seceded from the Union. And these states and where their allegiance lay was very much on the mind of President Lincoln throughout the Civil War. And to the extent that they were not included in the Emancipation Proclamation. And ultimately, it would take the 13th Amendment to do away with slavery in some of those areas.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevin. We had someone else mention December 6th, 1865, the 13th Amendment, why that day isn't necessarily celebrated maybe as much as Juneteenth is. But we could definitely, why not, right? We could definitely acknowledge and have exciting programs on December 6th, highlighting when it kind of becomes part of the Constitution with the 13th Amendment. So thank you for those questions and those comments, our friends who are writing kind of in the chat. We're very excited that you're all here.
And that is a great point. Yes, the December ratification of the 13th Amendment, which ultimately does sort of bring constitutional backing and muscle to the Emancipation Proclamation. Perhaps though, because Juneteenth is so close to the 4th of July and this ultimate promise of freedom and equality, celebrating it so close to Independence Day, there is sort of that connection there, looking at this period of Reconstruction as the nation's second founding, and looking at this period as sort of like a second independence, another coming of independence. So it does fit very nicely in the conversations that occurred, this idea of freedom, equality, and independence during late June and early July. But that, of course, is no reason why we cannot focus and again remember the significance. And December date is not too far away from the original ratification of the Bill of Rights. And we can all take time to reflect on the amendment process and significance that has had in transforming the Constitution, and particularly, of course, with the 13th Amendment.
Absolutely. And because we're mentioning civic season, we're right in the middle of civic season. We are going to be having a program on July 4th on Independence Day, kind of referencing this idea that Kevin discussed a little bit during the program, this idea of freedom not being for everyone yet, that July 4th is not everyone's Independence Day. We have a scholar from Westchester University who's going to be talking about Frederick Douglass's famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," where you reference these celebrations and how we kind of mark and celebrate days together as a whole, as civically minded, but we're going to see different perspectives on that, and that speech too, and kind of these celebrations around Juneteenth and Independence Day have opened up wider conversations for the end of slavery, for all. It's a celebration not just for African Americans, but for everyone, celebrating the end of slavery, of involuntary servitude. And so, because someone had mentioned in the chat too, you know, that extends to other portions of the population. We do know, of course, some of the indigenous nations, of course, and their connection to slavery as well. So it's a great time. It's a great time of year to talk about civic season, to talk about these celebrations, these commemorations, and we have more opportunities coming up. So keep an eye out for an email from the National Constitution Center for ways that you can participate in this civic season and learn a little bit more about we the people. So with that, I want to formally kind of end this portion of the program. I'm very excited to have you all here today, and thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a wonderful program. Kevin, I'll turn it over to you for final remarks, and then we'll log out.
Absolutely, Madison. Thank you. And there was one more sort of comment that came in that is worth mentioning, that with the Underground Railroad, this was not just people making their way north. For those in the deeper southern states, it was much harder to make their way north to freedom. So many of them would, in fact, head south or wherever the best possible chance of escape would have been. So that's certainly worth noting. The movement of the Underground Railroad is not just moving north, but wherever freedom would be. And certainly the even more stories. And it's remarkable listening to all of these wonderful presenters, these stories, and really taking time to reflect on just how many people were involved in this fight for freedom. So thank you all for being part of our discussion today. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, we look forward to talking to you all again soon. So with that, we'll